Reporting from the Globe and Mail this week reveals that Canada's military has reportedly been modeling a hypothetical U.S. invasion of our country. And while the scenario is unlikely and theoretical, it says planners within the Canadian Armed Forces see it as a necessary stress test of national security. So, what could that modeling look like? Joining us now is Christian Leuprecht, a military expert and professor at the Royal Military College and Queen's University. Christian, great to have you back on the show.
Hello, my pleasure.
All right, so if Canada were to face an invasion, Christian, how well equipped are we to respond to an attack and defend ourselves?
The Canadian Armed Forces are pretty significantly undercapitalized, understaffed, and underfunded, and have been for the last 25 or so years. So we're not in a position to defend ourselves against an invasion, let alone by the largest military in the world. But what this exercise shows that if you find yourself in that situation, the response would be sort of a quasi counterinsurgency. But I think there's a whole host of reasons you'd want to model this type of scenario, because it's going to show you a whole host of other weaknesses within the organization. It might help you prioritize where you want to prioritize staffing and where you want to prioritize equipment, because of sort of the overall cascading challenges within the organization. And look, militaries are an instrument of statecraft. And so there's an organization, the Canadian Armed Forces, called the Strategic Joint Staff, that develops these plans for different types of scenarios. And you have to be ready for any mandate that the government might ultimately give you if you're the Canadian Armed Forces. And you don't want to be planning that mandate when the government gives it to you. You want to come to the government with options. And so this is also about making sure the government understands what its options are and what its options are not under the current equipment and staffing and funding situation of the Canadian Armed Forces.
All right, so sort of like an emergency drill to see what we're working with here. And Christian, you mentioned counterinsurgency-style tactics that has been mentioned in this model. So what exactly does that mean, and why do you think Canada would be looking at this particular method?
So necessarily, if you're facing a much larger adversary who's much better equipped and has technological capabilities that far surpass your own, you're in a situation of asymmetric warfare and irregular warfare. And these are sort of the tactics that, for instance, we saw in Afghanistan, the tactics that we saw after the Iraq invasion by the United States. So we know roughly what this style of warfare looks like. But look, I mean, modeling this type of warfare isn't useful just necessarily for this particular type of scenario. But we would want to understand, for instance, if Canada would need to support other countries or allies around the world that have to engage in these types of tactics, how do we need to posture and equip ourselves? And of course, these are exactly the sort of tactics that Ukraine used against Russia in the early days of the Russian invasion, given the superior capabilities that the vastly superior materiel that Russia was able to bring to bear. So there's a host of reasons you would want to model this scenario without necessarily thinking that the immediate challenge here is a direct invasion by the United States.
All right. Now, Christian, of course, we've said it's hypothetical right now, but I mean, you mentioned the military is vastly underfunded. What should or could our government be doing in the meantime to bolster our military strength?
So the government, of course, has announced significant reinvestments in the Canadian Armed Forces. I think the most important takeaway for Canadians is that militaries as an instrument of statecraft is, in a volatile world, something you want to have in a very robust fashion, because it gives you options to shape that world and how you respond to that world. And I would say, if you look at the last 25 years, one of the things that we've done, not just as Canada, but as allies, we've let our capabilities on instruments of statecraft atrophy, and we've largely left international security up to the United States. And now we don't like the world that we live in. Well, if we don't like that world, then we should remember that after World War II, we also didn't like the world that we ended up in, and we aggressively invested in instruments of statecraft and institutions to shape that world. And so if we don't like where the 21st century is going, then perhaps as Canadians, we should rekindle that spirit of being active players, of shaping a very competitive, volatile, and hostile international environment in ways that aligns with our interests, rather than simply sitting on the sidelines and watching other people play and shape that game.
Christian, what message do you think our military reportedly creating this hypothetical model of a U.S. invasion sends to Washington and to the Trump administration?
Look, I think it's also not entirely perhaps coincidental that this becomes public at the time when the Prime Minister gives a speech in Davos about the rupture of the international world order, and that the relationship with the United States going forward is not, we're not going back to the status quo ante, and that we're living in a very different world. I think that the main messages of that speech, as much as the Prime Minister got a standing ovation for that excellent speech, that both the scenario sort of becoming public and the speech are actually for a Canadian domestic audience. Because the amounts of money that the Canadian government is already spending on the military, plus additional amounts it will likely need to spend, for instance, the submarine purchase that may cost us $100 billion upwards, those need to be socialized with the Canadian populations. We need to get social license for spending those amounts of money. We need to explain to Canadians why we're shifting our posture, especially at a time when many Canadians are hurting in terms of affordability, when other government departments are cutting their budgets and cutting their staff. And so I think this is part of a broader effort to explain to Canadians that we live in a very different type of world, and that if they cherish Canadian political and economic sovereignty, it will require significant investments and also significant sacrifices in many of the things that we have taken dear in order to protect that sovereignty.
All right, well, Christian, it looks like, and what looks like or has felt like it could be more imminent, was a potential takeover of Greenland. Trump is now saying that he won't use force to acquire the island. But all of this has really tested NATO in recent weeks, recent months, some calling it the biggest crisis that the alliance has faced in its entire history. Yesterday, Trump said that his NATO allies are unreliable partners, but his Secretary General Mark Rutte says that he's been able to sort of de-escalate things with Trump, at least for now, the two reaching this potential framework of a deal for the future of Greenland. I'm wondering, where do you think this leaves the defense alliance?
So there's also that famous statement by Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, that the United States projects strength, allies project weakness. There's certainly a perception in the United States that allies have not been doing enough and are not doing enough when it comes to the volatile world and the interests and security and defense that we ultimately need to assert. Look, I mean, it was never going to be easy to work with the United States in an alliance. Since George Washington, the mantra in the United States had been no entanglement. So that is to say, no alliance. So the US being in an alliance is a complete historical aberration. And as the first Secretary General of NATO said, what is the purpose of NATO? To keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. And so we knew from the beginning that working with the United States was always going to be very difficult, because the United States is inherently unilateral in the way it goes about asserting its interests and asserting its foreign policy. And so what we see is, I think, simply a continuation of that unilateralism in a very rapidly changing world where the United States wants to remain the global superpowers. This is what superpowers do. They want to stay on top. And of course, in that environment, the United States is dragging its allies along, whether they want to or not, because the United States knows allies really have no alternative. What world do they want to live in? One where allies ally with Russia and China? I think it is a difficult moment for NATO, but it's not the first time we faced that challenge. In the 1960s, France withdrew from the integrated command structure. We had Turkey invade Cyprus and the crisis with Greece. In the late 1970s, we had the US insisting on stationing nuclear weapons in Germany because it felt the German Bundeswehr was conventionally too weak. That brought the German government to fall at the time. The Iraq invasion, Macron calling NATO brain dead. Look, it's going to be difficult when you have 32 countries around the table, but the upside is it seems we can get everybody on the same page with aligning interests and negotiating arrangements. And it is the most successful and resilient military alliance, despite all its challenges over the years.
Well, do you think Trump has been using this as a negotiation tactic? Was there ever a real threat, do you think, of the U.S. taking over Greenland by force and sending in the military?
Oh, absolutely. Because this is different from the 3.5% increase in NATO defense spending that Trump got NATO member countries to pony up in the spring. In this case, menacing NATO allies, we are talking about the hemisphere. We are talking about North America. This is about homeland defense. And this is about the United States asserting its interests and its security in its backyard. And we see that the United States will act unilaterally if its interests are at stake. What was Venezuela about? It was about making sure Venezuela was effectively a Chinese, Russian, and Iranian client state, and that international and foreign meddling in the hemisphere will not be tolerated by the United States. Look at Panama, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba. The U.S. has a long history of acting unilaterally if its interests are at stake. And Trump basically said to allies that, look, we can sit down and we can try to work out a deal, or I'm going to do it my way. And all the allies realized Trump doing it his way wasn't going to work out well for anybody, in particular for Canada, because if Trump would have if the United States controls Greenland, and with NORAD likely atrophying in terms of its importance, that means the United States will be gaining greater control over the Arctic, and the United States gaining control over Greenland would mean the United States would now control all approaches to Canada, subsurface, maritime, air, and aerospace. That would effectively reduce us to a quasi-US colony. And I don't think that can possibly in it being Canadian political and economic sovereign interests. And so in my view, whatever we need to spend on the military and instruments of statecraft to assert our sovereignty is still better than us being reduced to a US colony.
Christian, as always, it's great to speak with you. Thank you so much for joining us today and providing your expertise and insights. We appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
That is Christian Leuprecht, military expert and professor at the Royal Military College and Queen's University.